The wind howled around the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, a fortress perched against the Welsh coast, battered endlessly by the sea. On this bitter winter night in January 1457, the towers stood like dark sentinels, their banners snapping in the storm. Beyond the ramparts, the countryside lay silent and frozen. But inside one chamber, behind a heavy oak door, a drama of life and death unfolded that would shape the future of England. On the narrow bed lay Margaret Beaufort, barely 13 years old, her frail body convulsed in waves of pain. Sweat slicked her brow, though the air was cold enough to make the chambermaids shiver. The midwives hovered with anxious glances, their hands red from the blood of endless attempts to ease the child into the world. Margaret was no ordinary girl. She carried in her veins the blood of kings, the Beaufort line, descendants of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. This lineage was both her curse and her destiny. Though a child herself, she had been married off to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI, in a union meant not for love but for power. Edmund, however, had died months before, leaving her widowed and alone, heavy with child, confined within this castle of stone. Now, the burden of childbirth threatened to extinguish her fragile life. Each contraction tore through her slight frame like fire. "She is too small," whispered one midwife to another. "Her hips are narrow. The child may claim her life." Margaret's knuckles turned white as she clutched the sheets. Her lips moved in fervent prayer, words barely audible over her ragged breathing. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, spare me. Let this child live, even if I do not." Outside, the storm raged like the wars that consumed England, the Wars of the Roses, Lancaster against York, Red Rose against White. Few in the kingdom noticed the plight of this girl in Wales, yet history itself held its breath. For in her womb lay a fragile spark of hope for the faltering house of Lancaster. The labor dragged on through hours of agony. At times, Margaret drifted toward unconsciousness, her face pale as death. The midwives exchanged worried looks. Some feared both mother and child would be lost before dawn. But Margaret's will was iron. She clenched her teeth and fought through each wave of pain, her body trembling yet unbroken. And then, at last, the moment came. With one final cry, Margaret pushed against the abyss of despair. A thin, piercing wail cut through the chamber. The midwife lifted a newborn boy, slick with blood, his voice strong despite his frailty. The sound filled the room like a miracle. "He lives," the midwife exclaimed, her eyes shining with relief. Margaret collapsed back against the pillows, barely conscious, her lips forming a faint smile. Her body was broken, but her spirit soared. "Henry," she whispered. "His name will be Henry." It was a name heavy with legacy, meant to honor King Henry VI, the gentle yet troubled monarch who clung desperately to the throne amidst chaos. For Margaret, the name was a prayer as much as a proclamation, that her son would not only survive, but rise to greatness. Yet even in this hour of triumph, shadows lingered. The childbirth had left Margaret grievously scarred. The midwives knew at once she would never again bear children. At 13, she had given all she could to the world. Her body would never fully heal. The price of Henry's life had been her youth, her health, and perhaps her happiness. Still, Margaret did not weep. Her gaze fixed on the infant swaddled in linen. His tiny chest rose and fell, each breath fragile yet defiant. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch his cheek. A strange calmness settled over her. Whatever storms lay ahead, this child was her purpose. Around them, Pembroke Castle stood silent once more, the storm easing into dawn. Few outside its walls took note of the boy born that night. He was no prince, no heir to a throne, merely the posthumous son of a dead earl and a mother too young. To the lords of England, he was insignificant, a pawn at best. But destiny had other designs. This child, Henry Tudor, would grow into the man who ended decades of civil war and founded the most famous dynasty in English history, the Tudors. For now, though, he was only a fragile infant in his mother's arms. Margaret Beaufort, scarcely more than a child herself, cradled him with the devotion of a lioness. Her body was shattered, but her will burned with a single vow: I will see you safe, my son, whatever the cost. It was a vow she would spend the rest of her life fulfilling. Long before the cries of Henry Tudor echoed in Pembroke Castle, his destiny had been written in blood. To understand the fragile boy swaddled in linen, one must trace the tangled web of his mother's lineage, the Beauforts, a family both blessed and cursed by their descent from kings. The story began with John of Gaunt, third son of King Edward III, one of the most powerful princes of medieval Europe. John of Gaunt was no mere noble, he ruled vast estates, commanded armies, and dreamed of thrones beyond England's shores. But it was not his lawful heirs who carved the deepest mark upon history, it was his children born of love, not law. Among John's many entanglements, the most fateful was his lifelong affair with Catherine Swynford, a woman of noble but modest birth. Their passion endured decades, scandalizing the court. Together they bore children who would later be legitimized by royal decree, taking the name Beaufort, after John's French castle of Beaufort and Valley. The legitimization, however, came with a dangerous caveat. Though the Beauforts were declared lawful, an explicit clause barred them from ever inheriting the crown. It was a safeguard meant to preserve the throne for Edward III's undisputed heirs. Yet in England, where ambition burned hotter than law, such words were never truly final. The Beauforts grew into a powerful house, wealthy, ambitious, and closely tied to the Lancastrian kings. They married into great families, served as councillors, generals, and patrons of the church. But their bloodline carried a shadow, the suspicion that they might one day reach too high. And from that lineage came Margaret Beaufort. Margaret's father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, had been a soldier in France during the last embers of the 100 Years' War. He returned to England broken, disgraced, and hounded by failure. In 1444, when Margaret was barely a year old, he fell into despair and died, rumors whispered by his own hand. Thus, the infant Margaret became the sole heiress to the Beaufort claim. Her guardianship was coveted fiercely. Whoever controlled the girl controlled her lands, her fortune, and, most dangerously, her royal blood. For though the law excluded the Beauforts from the crown, bloodlines in England had a way of defying parchment and seal. Margaret grew up under this weight. Pious and intelligent beyond her years, she seemed aware even in childhood that her life was not her own. God has given me a calling, she would later write, and I must follow it, though it cost me all. By the age of 12, Margaret's fate was sealed. The Wars of the Roses had begun, and the kingdom tore itself apart. The House of Lancaster, weakened and desperate, sought to bind her claim to their cause. She was wed to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI. It was no romantic union. Edmund was a man of 30, hardened by war and politics, while Margaret was still a child. Yet their marriage fused the Beaufort blood with the Tudor line, a Welsh house of humble origins that had risen swiftly through loyalty to Lancaster. The Tudors traced their lineage to Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire who had dared to love, and wed in secret, Catherine of Valois, the widow of King Henry V. From this audacious match sprang Edmund and Jasper Tudor, men who carried both Welsh pride and royal connection. Thus, when Margaret married Edmund, two legacies intertwined, the Lancastrian Beaufort claim and the Tudor ambition. It was a fragile thread of destiny, spun across generations of forbidden loves and dangerous gambles. But fate was cruel. Edmund Tudor did not live to see his son born. In 1456, amid the turbulence of war, he was captured by Yorkist forces and died of plague in captivity. Margaret, 13 years old and heavily pregnant, was left widowed in a hostile world. And so, when Henry Tudor was born at Pembroke Castle in January 1457, he carried the full weight of his inheritance, from the Beauforts, the blood of Edward III, tinged with the stain of illegitimacy yet rich with royal claim. From the Tudors, the fierce resilience of a Welsh house that had clawed its way from obscurity to stand beside kings. Few could have imagined that this fragile infant, born of grief and peril, would one day wield both legacies to seize the crown of England. Yet the seed of destiny was there, planted in blood older than his name. For now, though, Henry was only a child in his mother's arms. Margaret, still weak from childbirth, gazed upon him with both awe and fear. She knew too well that his blood would make him a target. The world outside Pembroke was cruel, ruled by men who would not hesitate to crush a boy whose very existence threatened their power. In that moment, Margaret made her vow. If the Beaufort blood had cursed her, she would transform it into a blessing for her son. She would raise him not merely to survive, but to claim the destiny fate had set before him. Thus, the story of Henry Tudor began not with swords or crowns, but with the fragile bond between a mother and her child, bound together by the dangerous legacy of the Beaufort bloodline. And the kingdom, though it did not yet know it, had just witnessed the birth of a dynasty. England in the mid-15th century was a kingdom trembling on the edge of ruin. Though the infant Henry Tudor lay hidden in Pembroke, the wider stage was already ablaze. To understand the storm that would shape his future, one must step back and witness the beginning of the most infamous civil conflict in English history, the Wars of the Roses. At its heart, the war was a struggle for legitimacy, a question of who truly had the right to wear the crown of England. The seeds were planted long before Henry Tudor's birth, in the fragile reign of King Henry VI. Henry VI was a man unsuited to kingship. Gentle, pious, and easily swayed, he lacked the fire of his warrior father, Henry V, the victor of Agincourt. Where Henry V had inspired armies, Henry VI inspired pity. He was more monk than monarch, more scholar than soldier. His crown weighed heavily on his troubled mind. The king's weakness left a vacuum, and into that void stepped ambitious men. Chief among them was Richard, Duke of York. Richard was no ordinary noble. His bloodline stretched directly to Edward III, giving him a claim to the throne as strong, perhaps stronger, than Henry VI himself. Though sworn to loyalty, Richard harbored resentment. He saw the kingdom slipping into chaos, France lost in humiliating defeats, the royal treasury drained, and the court dominated by favorites who lined their own pockets while the people starved. At first, Richard sought not the crown but reform. He demanded better governance, less corruption, and a council free of sycophants. But suspicion grew on both sides. To the Lancastrians, Richard was not a loyal duke but a rival with dangerous ambitions. And then came the breaking point, the king's madness. In 1453, news of defeat in France shattered Henry VI. He collapsed into a catatonic stupor, unable to speak, unable to rule. For over a year England drifted leaderless. It was in this void that Richard, Duke of York, was appointed protector of the realm, effectively ruler in all but name. But Richard's authority was fragile, for one woman refused to accept his rise, Margaret of Anjou, the Queen. Margaret was everything her husband was not, proud, ambitious, and fiercely determined. She saw herself as the guardian of her husband's crown and the future of her young son, Prince Edward. To her, Richard was no protector but a usurper waiting for the chance to seize the throne. She gathered loyal nobles around her, whispering that the Duke of York plotted to destroy the royal line. When Henry VI miraculously recovered his senses in late 1454, Margaret struck. Richard was stripped of power, his allies dismissed, and his enemies placed in positions of influence. The kingdom divided, York and his supporters on one side, Margaret and the Lancastrians on the other. The first clash came in 1455, at a market town called St. Albans. It was not yet a war, but a skirmish, swift, brutal, and decisive. Richard of York, alongside his ally the powerful Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, routed the king's forces. Henry VI himself was captured. The Roses of York and Lancaster had drawn blood. Though peace was patched together, the wound was deep. Each side accused the other of treachery, each plotted in secret, and soon the realm was at war in earnest. The wars were unlike any England had seen before. They were not fought against foreign enemies but brother against brother, cousin against cousin. Great houses, Percy against Neville, Stafford against Courtenay, tore themselves apart. Armies marched beneath banners of the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, though in truth, many men fought not for roses but for survival, land, or loyalty to their lords. The years that followed were a whirlwind of shifting fortunes. In 1460, Richard of York pressed his claim boldly, seeking recognition as heir to the throne. But his ambition cost him dearly. At the Battle of Wakefield, he was slain, his head impaled on the gates of York with a paper crown mockingly set upon it. Yet the Yorkist cause did not die. Richard's son, Edward of March, rose in his place. Young, charismatic, and brilliant in battle, Edward carried his father's banner with ruthless energy. At Towton in 1461, amid a snowstorm and rivers running red with blood, Edward crushed the Lancastrian army in the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Henry VI fled into exile. Edward of March was crowned Edward IV, King of England. For a moment, it seemed the Yorkists had triumphed. But the wars were far from over. Henry VI and Queen Margaret, though beaten, refused to yield. From Scotland and France, they schemed, plotting to reclaim their crown. Margaret became the beating heart of the resistance, rallying loyalists, promising revenge, and reminding all that her son, Prince Edward, still lived. And amid this chaos, the Tudors, Margaret Beaufort and her infant son Henry, were forced into the shadows. With their Lancastrian blood, they were natural targets for Yorkist suspicion. Jasper Tudor, Henry's uncle, became his protector, guarding the boy from Yorkist reach. For in these wars, children with royal blood often met grim fates. The Wars of the Roses were not merely about crowns. They were about survival. Houses rose and fell, fortunes were made and destroyed, and England itself seemed cursed by endless bloodshed. And yet, out of this storm, destiny was quietly shaping Henry Tudor. Though only a child, far removed from battlefields, the tides of war would decide his path. Every victory of York threatened his life, every triumph of Lancaster gave him hope. He was not yet a player in the game, but already, his existence was a card to be played, a pawn in a struggle that would one day make him king. While England bled on the fields of Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury, Henry Tudor's world was far smaller, the cold stone halls of Pembroke Castle, the watchful eyes of his mother Margaret Beaufort, and the steady protection of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke. Henry's early years were defined not by triumphs but by survival. From the moment of his birth in 1457, he carried the burden of his blood. Through his mother, he was the last hope of the Beaufort line, descended from the royal house of Lancaster. But that blood was both a blessing and a curse. In an age when royal blood was currency, it made Henry a prize worth keeping, or killing. His mother, Margaret, was still barely more than a child herself when she bore him. At just 13 years old, she was widowed, her husband Edmund Tudor dead of plague. Her devotion to Henry was fierce, but her power was limited. It was Jasper, Edmund's brother, who became Henry's shield. Jasper Tudor was no ordinary guardian. Loyal to the Lancastrian cause, he fought in battle after battle to defend Henry VI's crumbling crown. Yet even as he commanded men, his thoughts often turned to the small boy hidden away in Pembroke. To Jasper, Henry was more than a nephew, he was Lancaster's last ember, a spark that might one day ignite into flame. But the Yorkist victories darkened Henry's world. In 1461, when Edward IV seized the throne, Lancastrian power collapsed. Queen Margaret fled north, Henry VI was reduced to a fugitive king, and Jasper was hunted. For the young Henry, the consequences were immediate and cruel. His lands at Pembroke were confiscated, his titles stripped, and, most devastating of all, he was taken from his family. The Yorkists gave the boy into the custody of William Herbert, a staunch supporter of Edward IV. For nearly a decade, Henry lived under Yorkist watch, raised not as a prisoner in chains, but as a ward molded for their purposes. Herbert intended to marry Henry into his family, a way to control the boy's dangerous bloodline. Imagine the weight on that child. By day, he was tutored in courtesy, languages, and the skills of a nobleman. By night, he must have wondered, was he Lancaster or York? Was he destined for greatness, or the executioner's block? Even at such a young age, Henry learned caution, patience, and silence. He understood that one wrong word could betray him. He learned to survive not by strength of arms but by endurance, by waiting for the right moment to act. Meanwhile, the kingdom churned with war. In 1469, discontent with Edward IV's rule brought rebellion. The powerful Warwick, the kingmaker, who had once crowned Edward, turned against him. The realm fractured once more, and Henry's fate shifted with it.
When Edward IV was briefly driven into exile in 1470, Henry VI was restored to the throne. For Lancaster, it was a flicker of hope. Jasper Tudor seized the chance to recover his nephew. For a brief moment, Henry was reunited with the Lancastrians. The boy who had lived in the shadows now stood, however faintly, in the light of his heritage. But hope was short-lived. In 1471, Edward IV returned with a vengeance. At Barnet, Warwick fell. At Tewkesbury, Margaret of Anjou's army was shattered. Her son, the Lancastrian Prince Edward, slain on the battlefield. Soon after, Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London. The House of Lancaster lay in ruins. Its leaders were dead, its cause destroyed. And in this desolation, the boy Henry Tudor was all that remained. Jasper Tudor knew the danger. Edward IV would not ignore a surviving heir. The choice was clear: Henry must flee or perish. So in the summer of 1471, uncle and nephew slipped away, crossing the stormy waters of the Bristol Channel. Chased by Yorkist patrols, battered by wind and wave, they sought sanctuary across the sea. Their destination? Brittany, a small but powerful duchy in France. There, in exile, Henry Tudor began the long wait that would define his life. For 14 years, he would live as a guest, and sometimes as a hostage, of foreign dukes and kings. In those years, he would grow from a quiet boy into a cautious, observant man, always on the edge of danger, always uncertain if he would live to see the next day. Yet in that exile, destiny was ripening. For though Lancaster seemed dead, though York ruled England with confidence, the wheel of fortune never stopped turning. The boy in the shadows, forgotten by many, would one day emerge as the man to claim the crown itself. But for now, Henry Tudor remained what he had always been: a child of war, an exile, and the last ember of a fallen house. The boy who left England in 1471 was only 14 years old. Yet already he bore the weight of a dynasty's destruction. With Henry VI murdered in the Tower, Edward of Westminster slain at Tewkesbury, and Margaret of Anjou broken in captivity, Henry Tudor was the last Lancastrian of royal blood. That made him priceless and perilous. When Jasper Tudor led his nephew across the sea, they arrived not in safety but in a political chessboard. Their refuge, the Duchy of Brittany, was ruled by Duke Francis II, a man both shrewd and cautious. He understood exactly what Henry represented: not just a boy in exile, but a potential bargaining chip against Edward IV of England. At first, Francis welcomed the Tudors warmly, granting them protection and estates. Henry lived in castles such as Vaughan, and later at the ducal court in Rennes. His life was far removed from the violence of English battlefields. He learned French, observed courtly manners, and cultivated the patience of one who knew that his fate was not his own to command. But Brittany was no sanctuary of loyalty. Henry soon realized he was less a guest than a hostage. Edward IV never forgot the boy across the Channel. Envoys were dispatched, bribes offered, and threats whispered. The Yorkist king wanted Henry returned to England, where a swift execution would silence the last Lancastrian hope forever. Francis played a dangerous game. Sometimes he promised to deliver Henry to Edward. Other times he swore to protect him. In truth, he meant to keep Henry alive, not out of compassion, but because the boy was his most valuable card in diplomacy. For Henry, this meant living under constant uncertainty. On more than one occasion, he and Jasper prepared to flee deeper into France, fearing betrayal. At times, Henry was even placed under guard, watched day and night to prevent escape or abduction. 14 long years passed this way, and yet in those years of waiting, Henry grew into a man of resilience. He was not a warrior like Edward IV, nor a firebrand like Warwick the Kingmaker. He was something rarer, a survivor who mastered caution, silence, and the art of enduring until fortune turned. Across the Channel, fortune was indeed shifting. Edward IV ruled firmly, but beneath the surface, tensions brewed. His brother Clarence plotted rebellions. Warwick's old followers simmered with resentment, and the nobility remained divided. The peace Edward had forged was fragile. Then, in 1483, fate struck. Edward IV was dead, struck down in the prime of his power at only 40 years old. His heir, the 12-year-old Edward V, was placed under the protection of his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Within weeks, Richard seized the crown for himself, declaring the boy illegitimate. The young Edward and his brother were locked in the Tower of London and never seen again. England gasped. The prince's disappearance cast a shadow of murder across Richard III's reign. Noble houses once loyal to York began to waver. Discontent spread. Old Lancastrians stirred. And across the sea in Brittany, a man now in his mid-20s listened intently. For the first time in his life, Henry Tudor was not merely a fugitive. He was the last untainted alternative to a tyrant king. Jasper Tudor knew it. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother in England, knew it. Disaffected nobles began to know it too. Letters were smuggled, alliances whispered, oaths sworn. Henry Tudor, the boy who had grown up in shadows, was now being called to step forward as Lancaster's champion. But before he could claim destiny, he needed allies, an army, and legitimacy. And above all, he needed to survive long enough to set foot on English soil again. The stage was set. The Wars of the Roses, long thought finished, were about to roar back to life, this time with Henry Tudor at their center. When Richard, Duke of Gloucester, took the crown in 1483, he styled himself as Richard III, rightful King of England. He justified it by claiming that his brother Edward IV's children were illegitimate. But few believed. Fewer still forgave. The disappearance of the two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard of York, haunted the realm. Though their fate was never proven, suspicion fell squarely on Richard III. The image of a usurper who had destroyed innocent heirs poisoned his reign from the very beginning. Across England, resentment grew. Some nobles whispered that a Yorkist branch might yet challenge Richard, but others looked further back, to the line of Lancaster, long extinguished, save for one man, Henry Tudor. At first, Henry's claim seemed laughably thin. He was descended through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, from John of Gaunt, but through a line once barred from succession. Yet compared to Richard, blackened by the stain of the prince's blood, Henry's weakness began to look like strength. It was Margaret Beaufort who moved first. Clever, calculating, and utterly determined to see her son rise, she reached out in secret to Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed queen of Edward IV. Here lay genius. The Yorkist queen and the Lancastrian heir had every reason to be enemies. Yet desperation forged alliance. They agreed, if Henry could seize the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV. That promise bound red rose and white together. The dream of a new Tudor dynasty, uniting Lancaster and York, was born. Armed with this pact, rebellion stirred. Richard III's former ally, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, turned traitor. He raised an army in the king's own heartlands. The banner of resistance flew, and across the Channel, Henry Tudor prepared to sail for England. But fate dealt him a cruel first blow. In October 1483, as Henry gathered ships in Brittany, storms scattered his fleet. Many of his men drowned, others were driven back to France. Henry himself barely escaped capture, forced to turn away before he could even land. Meanwhile, on English soil, Buckingham's rebellion collapsed. His forces melted away in the rain, and the Duke was betrayed, captured, and swiftly executed by Richard. The uprising had failed. Henry Tudor's great chance had slipped through his fingers, and yet, ironically, it made him stronger. For though the rebellion ended in blood, the conspirators who survived had nowhere else to turn. They had already burned their bridges with Richard. Their only hope was the man in exile, Henry Tudor. Thus, by failure, his legitimacy as leader of the opposition was cemented. From that day forward, every plot against Richard III circled around one name, Henry. But danger pressed close. Richard was furious. He pressured Duke Francis of Brittany to hand Henry over. The plan was nearly sealed. Henry would have been delivered into Yorkist hands and killed, had not a warning reached him at the last moment. In a desperate flight, Henry slipped away into neighboring France, where King Charles VIII's regents received him warmly. Unlike Brittany, France had no desire to bargain him away. Instead, they saw him as a useful weapon against Richard III. At last, Henry had found safe ground, and with it, the support he needed to prepare for the final clash. 14 years of exile were ending. The boy who had fled as a shadow of Lancaster was now returning as its champion, backed by French gold, English rebels, in the dream of a dynasty. The stage was set for the decisive struggle of the Wars of the Roses. The next time Henry Tudor set foot in England, he would either wear a crown or die in the attempt. By 1485, Henry Tudor had waited almost half his life in exile. Now, with French backing, he prepared for the gamble that would decide England's future. He was no longer the hunted boy of 1471. He was a man of 27, hardened by years of survival, with one goal burning in his heart: the crown. The invasion plan: France supplied Henry with money, weapons, and around 2,000 mercenaries, seasoned soldiers of fortune. Welsh exiles and loyal Englishmen added to his ranks. It was not a massive army, but it was enough to spark rebellion at home. His strategy was daring. Rather than land in the south, where Richard III's forces were strongest, Henry chose to sail west, to Pembrokeshire in Wales, the land of his birth, where he hoped his ancestry would win support. In August 1485, Henry's ships touched the Welsh shore. The exile had returned. The march through Wales, at first few joined him. His force seemed too small, too uncertain. But Henry pressed on, moving carefully across the countryside, gathering men as he marched. His greatest gamble lay with the Stanley family, powerful lords whose loyalty was famously slippery. Thomas, Lord Stanley, was married to Henry's own mother, Margaret Beaufort, yet outwardly served Richard III. His brother, Sir William Stanley, commanded strong forces in Cheshire. Would they betray Henry or betray Richard? No one could tell, and Henry had no choice but to march, not knowing on which side the Stanleys would fall. Richard prepares for war. Meanwhile, Richard III was not idle. He gathered a much larger army, perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 strong, drawn from loyal Yorkist lands. By contrast, Henry's force barely reached 5,000. Richard had the numbers, the crown, and the advantage. But Henry had hope, and the promise of uniting Lancaster and York through marriage. The two armies moved inexorably toward one another. By mid-August, their paths converged near a small market town in Leicestershire. The field was called Bosworth. The eve of battle. On the night before combat, Richard's men camped with confidence. Their king swore to crush the pretender with his own hands. Henry, in contrast, spoke quietly to his captains. He knew the odd, but he also knew that fortune in war could turn on a single decision or a single betrayal. Everything hung on whether the Stanleys would stand aside or choose a side. As dawn broke on the 22nd of August, 1485, the sun rose over misty fields, and two armies prepared to fight for England's soul. It would be the last great clash of the Wars of the Roses, and before the day was done, the fate of kings and the birth of a dynasty would be sealed. At Bosworth Field, Richard III's 12,000 men stood against Henry Tudor's 5,000. Watching nearby were the Stanleys with their own 6,000, waiting for the right moment to act. The clash begins. Henry's smaller army advanced cautiously, shielded by his French mercenaries. Richard's larger host pressed forward with fury. Steel rang out across the fields. Arrows darkened the sky. The Stanleys stayed still, watching. Neither king could be sure if they were friend or foe. Richard's gamble. Seeing Henry at a distance, Richard made a bold choice. He would end the war himself. Leading a mounted charge with his knights, Richard thundered across the field, cutting down all who stood in his path. Chroniclers say he struck with such power that Henry's standard-bearer fell before him. It seemed Richard might kill Henry with his own sword. The turning point. At that desperate moment, Sir William Stanley's forces moved. They swept down to shield Henry, surrounding Richard's charge. The king found himself cut off, fighting alone. Refusing to flee, Richard battled to the last. He was dragged from his horse and slain on the field. Thus ended the last Plantagenet king. Henry Tudor was victorious. On the battlefield, the crown, Richard's battered circlet, was found in the mud and placed upon Henry's head. Soldiers hailed him as King Henry VII. He had won not just by arms, but by patience, diplomacy, and the gamble of a lifetime. Richard's body was taken to Leicester and buried without ceremony. With him, the male line of the House of York was extinguished. Victory in battle was only the beginning. Henry needed legitimacy. He acted with precision. He dated his reign to the day before Bosworth, making all who fought for Richard legally traitors. He arranged to marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV, uniting Lancaster and York in one crown. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York became the Tudor rose, symbol of unity. With one marriage, Henry ended 30 years of civil war. Henry and Elizabeth's union produced heirs, binding the once bitter factions. Their first son, Arthur, was named for the legendary King of Britain, a symbol of new beginnings. Their second son, Henry VIII, would one day reshape England forever. Through this union, the Tudor dynasty was born. Henry ruled with caution. He strengthened royal finances, curbed overmighty nobles, and built a crown more stable than any in a century. He was not the fiery warrior like Richard, nor the charming king like Edward IV. He was a survivor, a patient player who turned exile into empire. From the ashes of the Wars of the Roses, he forged peace. Bosworth did not just crown a new king, it closed an era. The House of Lancaster lived on through Henry. The House of York lived on through Elizabeth. Together, they created something new, the Tudors. England, weary of bloodshed, embraced the Union. The Tudors became one of the most famous dynasties in the world. Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, the great dramas of church and empire. But it all began with one man's survival, one mother's determination, and one battle in 1485. Henry Tudor, once a hunted exile, died as a king, father of a dynasty and founder of modern England. The boy who fled at 14 had returned at 27, defeated a king, and changed history. His story reminds us, sometimes history turns not on strength of arms alone, but on patience, timing, and the courage to seize the moment when it comes. From Bosworth's field rose the Tudor rose, red, white, and eternal. Flower.